Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of my Tragedy Looper video series. In the second video, I'm going to show you exactly how to play Tragedy Looper. Now, a really quick warning about Tragedy Looper. Tragedy Looper is a scenario-based game. Matter of fact, the very basic game comes with 10 very complete scenarios that play very, very differently, and they ramp up the difficulty quite a bit, all the way from the easiest level all the way up to an extremely challenging difficulty level. And there's also some instructions in there that tell you exactly how to create your own scenarios. Here's the trick though, I don't want to ruin this game for people who just want to learn how to play and see an actual review for the game, and if they like it, they want to actually go out there and play the game. So in this tutorial video series, I basically created a completely fluffed scenario. I don't even know if it's going to work. I'm basically going to be lampooning a movie. And as a matter of fact, as a little bit of a side note, if you figure out which movie I'm lampooning, please don't leave any comments in the YouTube comments below about the name of the movie. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I'm going to put on a little bit of a contest, and if you can figure out the name of the movie I'm actually lampooning, it's going to be worth 1 entry into the contest. That'll be a video that's coming up pretty darn soon. It's for the deluxe wooden box for Dungeon Lord. So that's something you're interested in. Don't leave the name of the movie because you're going to give it away. You're going to give everybody else 1 free entry into the contest. Back on point though, completely made up scenario. I don't even know if this scenario is going to work. I'm basically just using this just to teach you how to play Tragedy Looper the game. To understand how to play Tragedy Looper, it's best to understand the actual concept of the game. See, in Tragedy Looper, the players are time travelers who all have the ability to travel back in time. The trick is one of the players is a mastermind who's trying to change history and create a bad situation that affects the time flow for the rest of history, while the other players are trying to stop the mastermind from changing and creating that terrible, horrible future. In the game, each player is going to get a hand of cards which they're going to use to interact with their current scenario. Now the game is a little bit abstracted because nobody has a pawn that can be moving around the board to interact with these players. Basically, the one player, the mastermind, is going to have a hand of cards, and they're going to play these cards on either the NPCs or they're going to play cards on locations. The mastermind gets to play up to 3 cards on their turn, and again you can play those between the NPCs and between the locations. Then every single hero gets a chance to play 1 card. Now they can play one of those cards either where the mastermind has already played a card, or then go ahead and play one of these cards on various other locations, NPCs, and try to gather evidence or information that helps them figure out exactly what is going to happen with this tragedy. The challenge for the game though is that the mastermind controls all the cards literally, because the mastermind knows everything that's going to be happening. The mastermind knows the roles every single one of these NPCs is going to take in the game. The mastermind knows exactly what they need to do to win. The mastermind has all the information, and our heroes have none of the information, except for they know very little bit that there's going to be some tragedies that are going to happen on certain days. They know how many days they have to figure things out, and they know how many times they can fail before history has been permanently changed and they lose the game completely. Now, adding on to this complexity though is that the heroes need to be watching everything the mastermind is doing and trying to deduce exactly what is going on by looking at a sheet that is a complete list of all the possible roles in the scenario, all the possible situations that can occur, and everything that can happen in the scenario. So players need to deduce by everything that's going on and try to figure out which one of the plots is happening, which subplots are going on, which roles all these NPCs are taking, and exactly which kind of tragedies are happening. And they need to use all this information to stop these tragedies from happening. Because if our heroes can make it through 1 complete loop without any of the tragedies happening, they win the game. But if the mastermind can manage to get through all the loops and manage to make a tragedy happen every single time, the mastermind is going to win the game. And also the mastermind, if they manage to kill all their heroes, they're also going to win that loop. Not quite the game unless that's the final loop, then that would give them, the mastermind, the victory for that scenario. It's not all doom and gloom for our heroes though, because even if they get through all the loops without managing to stop the tragedy from happening, they do get 1 more chance to try to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. See, at the end of every scenario, when you're playing the more advanced scenarios, the heroes get the chance to try to deduce every single role, every single NPC played in that scenario. If the heroes can successfully deduce every single role, every single NPC played, they still manage to win the game and stop the mastermind from fulfilling his nefarious plans and destroying the history timeline. Now the way this will work is, let's say for example, during a day, the mastermind decides to play a card that's going to allow him to move the doctor into another location. And then he also happens to play a card that's going to add intrigue to the alien. Now, even though it says alien, don't think this means alien from the planet Mars. It just may mean somebody who is not quite human. So after these cards are resolved, let's say the Mastermind, and this happens to be day number 2 in this scenario. Let's say the Mastermind at the end of the day announces that the alien has died, the loop has ended, and our heroes have lost this scenario. So now what our heroes must do, they must look at the scenario sheet and try to figure out exactly what has happened, what roles were involved, and try to figure out exactly why that caused the loop to happen. Well, if we go ahead and look at our scenario sheet, we can see that there is somebody who has a role called the killer. And it says that if they happen to be in the same location with the key person, and the key person has enough intrigue on them, they kill the key person. So we look at this and say, hey, maybe the doctor happens to be the killer, and maybe the alien happens to be the key person. And it says if the key person dies, that loop has ended. But we have a little bit of trick going on right here. We also know that this is day 2, and day 2 the scenario says that there's going to be a murder happening. Now the murder has different requirements, so now we have a little bit of a mind game going on between the Mastermind and our protagonist. Did all this happen because of some of the roles happening, or did all this happen because this was an incident that was meant to happen? So now you see the deep mind game that goes on between the Mastermind and the players as they try to get through these scenarios, and our protagonists try to save history while the Mastermind tries to destroy history. To play Tragedy Looper, the first thing you need to do is you need to set up the game boards. Now the game does come with 4 different game boards which represent the different locations, and the game boards do have to be set up in a very specific certain location: hospital, shrine, city, and school. And you know you set up the game boards correctly because there's going to be little images in the corners, and if all these images intersect, you set up the game board correctly. Now every one of these game boards give a little bit of information on them. They list which kind of NPCs start in those locations, which NPCs are forbidden from ever entering those locations, and there's also a section for you to add intrigue counters for the Mastermind to add intrigue counters to those locations, which can also cause different tragedies to happen for our heroes. Next, each team gets a script card. First, you have the Mastermind who gets a script card which the protagonists are never allowed to look at because it kind of gives away the complete scenario and all the tricks and traps that may happen for our protagonist. And then the protagonist will get their script card, which is a very broken down, very loose idea of exactly what's going to happen. This is going to tell our heroes which tragedy set they're using. And in the basic game, there are 2 tragedy sets to use. You have the first steps, which is a very basic scenario that you should use for the first 2 times you play the game. And then you have the basic tragedy scenarios, which are much more tough, much more complex. Now, the difference between these is the basic tragedies always have 1 main plot and 2 subplots, while the first step only has 1 plot and 1 subplot. And additionally, when you're playing with the first steps, the heroes do not get the extra guess at the end of the scenario to save them if they didn't make it through all the loops successfully. But if you happen to be playing one of the basic tragedies, the heroes do get that final guess at the very end of the scenario to try to save their skins and get 1 more chance to win the scenario. The scenario card is also going to list how many loops are going to be in the scenario, which is basically how many chances our heroes have to try to stop the tragedy from happening. Every time they fail a loop, no matter which day they happen to be on, they're going to have to re-loop and start the entire scenario all over again, and they're going to keep doing that until they either make it through 1 complete loop and the tragedy of any kind doesn't happen, or if they get all the way through loops and again they get that final guess to try to save their skins and try to win the game. Next thing is going to tell them which kind of incidents are going to happen, exactly which days those are going to happen on. Now this is tracked over here on the board. This section right here tracks exactly which day the players are currently going, and consider each day is basically 1 round of the game. Players are going to get the chance to play cards every single round or every single day until they fail that loop, and again everything resets. And you're also going to place these little daggers out here as a friendly reminder to our heroes to let them know that there's going to be an incident that's going to occur on those days if certain requirements are met. Now again, this card is for our heroes to look at, and they can use it to get any kind of hints or any clues they need to try to figure out the scenario. And again, the Mastermind gets their card that tells them everything that's going on, and this is a card that the protagonists are never allowed to look at. Next, the Mastermind needs to add all the NPCs onto the locations. Remember, every single NPC starts in a very specific location, is listed on the card, is also listed on the board as a friendly reminder. And there's also this little symbol right here which happens to match these symbols on the game board, highlighted in white, again as a nice reminder to let you know exactly where that NPC starts. Every single NPC, no matter which scenario you're playing, always starts in the same location. And don't forget, the Mastermind script card lists all the NPCs who are included in this current scenario, every single role those NPCs may possibly be involved with or what kind of role they may have, and also lists exactly which incidents are going to occur, which day they're going to occur, and exactly which one of these NPCs is going to be the culprit. Here's the trick in the game. An NPC can have a role and they can also be involved in an incident. They're not mutually exclusive. So somebody could potentially be a key person and they also could be involved in a suicide. Thematically makes sense, but just don't forget, just because they have a role as a key person doesn't mean they can't also be involved in an incident. Every single NPC in the game has a couple stats that are very consistent for them between every single scenario. Every single NPC is going to have a paranoia limit. Now it's called a limit, but don't get confused by the term of paranoia limit. All that means is that is the amount of paranoia it takes for them to trigger an incident, but they can always have more paranoia than what their paranoia limit happens to be. So for example, the police officer has a paranoia limit of 3. He can have more paranoia on him than that, but it takes at least 3 paranoia on him for him to trigger an incident, assuming he is actually involved in an incident. Now remember, not all NPCs are going to be involved in incidents. Not all NPCs will have a role, so sometimes this could be a bluff played by the mastermind, but if they are involved in an incident, that's how much paranoia it takes for them to cause that incident, assuming the other conditions are met for that incident to occur. Every single NPC is also going to have a couple key phrases, and those are pretty dependent on every specific scenario. For example, some special abilities may say that you can use this special ability on anybody who happens to be a student. So if they happen to have a key phrase that says student, that special ability can be used on that one, and multiple NPCs may be classified as students. If you look at the police officer, we see that he's listed as an adult and a man. So if any cards or scenarios say that it can affect a man or an adult, he can be a target of those special abilities. Additionally, you're going to see that every one of these heroes has a certain amount of hearts, and these are called Goodwill abilities. Now, Goodwill abilities have a certain amount of hearts that are required to trigger those special abilities. The nice thing about Goodwill abilities is that they're not actually spent. Just like paranoia, they're just a minimum amount that needs to be met before those special abilities can be triggered. So, for example, the police officer has 2 special abilities. He has one that requires 4 Goodwill and one that requires 5 Goodwill. So as soon as the police officer has 5 Goodwill on him, the heroes can use his Goodwill abilities. Now again, the Goodwill is not spent at all. Once they have the minimum amount of Goodwill, they can go ahead and use those special abilities. Now there's one slight caveat to this rule though. You'll see that some special abilities have this little symbol right here which looks like a little loop symbol. What that symbol means is that this special ability can only be used once per loop. Not once per day, once per loop. Now not all Goodwill abilities are listed like that. Some Goodwill abilities do not have that symbol, which means that special Goodwill ability can be used every single day by our heroes, and some Goodwill abilities can also be used by the Mastermind, so don't get tripped up by that. But that symbol right there does mean that Goodwill ability can only be used once per loop. Not every single NPC in the game has a Goodwill ability. Some of the NPCs do not have them. For example, the patient doesn't have any Goodwill abilities, but for the most part, every single NPC has a Goodwill ability of some kind that our heroes can exploit to help them try to figure out exactly what is going on, just as long as the minimum amount of Goodwill has been met for that ability to be triggered. And again, really important point, Goodwill is not spent. It's not like you use the ability and then the Goodwill is discarded. That Goodwill stays on the NPC for the rest of the game. And as a matter of fact, if that NPC happens to be killed, they still keep their Goodwill because there is actually one NPC in the game who can actually bring dead NPCs back to life. And this is very, very important. If an NPC is ever killed, they keep their Goodwill. So if they're brought back to life, they do come back to life with all their Goodwill. The only thing that gets rid of all the Goodwill is when a loop is ended and everything resets. Because when a loop ends, everybody goes back to their location. All the intrigue goes away. And everything resets except for the knowledge that the players have gained by playing through that one loop. The general concept to understand here, though, is that Goodwill is generally good for the good guys, and paranoia is usually bad for the good guys, because paranoia is going to allow the mastermind to start triggering incidents. Now, not every single incident is going to be involved in every single scenario, so the players must watch what is occurring again to try to deduce which NPCs are creating these incidents and how they can stop these incidents from happening by playing all their cards and stopping the mastermind from fulfilling their goals. Now the trick with every single one of these incidents though is that an NPC cannot create that incident unless certain conditions are met. Now, the biggest condition requirement for an incident to occur is that NPC has to be at their paranoia limit. Now, some incidents have an additional requirement. For example, the faraway murder requires the person who's going to commit the faraway murder to have at least be at their paranoia limit. Now, again, this isn't verbally said to the protagonist. They need to deduce this by figuring out, because our mastermind is always very vague and just tells them results, not cause. So in this example, let's say our police officer happens to have 3 paranoia on them, and we also see that the alien happens to have 2 intrigue on them. Now, the requirement for the faraway murder says that one character with at least 2 intrigue dies. So a certain amount of requirements must be met here. The person committing the faraway murder must be at their paranoia limit, and their victim has to have at least that much intrigue on them. If one of those conditions are not met, then that incident cannot occur. So if the alien only happen to have 1 intrigue on them, and we know the faraway murder is going to occur on day number 2, and at the end of the day, we, as the mastermind, don't get enough intrigue on the alien, that incident is not going to occur. And the best thing that their heroes will know is that a faraway murder could have happened, but something prevented it. But if that second intrigue happened to get on the alien, that faraway murder will happen. This NPC will die, and if they happen to be the key person, that loop is going to create a tragedy, and that loop will end. Now that you understand the results, let's go ahead and look at the cause of all these things that may occur. Every single player in the game is going to get a hand of cards. Now, the mastermind gets their own hand of cards, and you can recognize these because they have a little mastermind symbol on the back of them. But every single player is also going to get their own single hand of cards. Now, all these cards for every one of the protagonists isn't exactly the same. They get the exact same cards, while their mastermind gets some cards that are a little bit different from the heroes. And not only that, the mastermind gets to play more cards than the heroes get to actually play individually. See, on a single player's turn, every single day is pretty much a turn in this game. And the way this is going to go is the mastermind is going to play 3 cards on their turn, and now these cards can either be played on a location or they be played on an NPC, and these cards are going to go ahead and produce effects. Now, every single one of our heroes gets to play 1 card individually. So in total, the heroes get to play a total of 3 cards, and the mastermind gets to play a total of 3 cards. There's some caveats though, and there are some restrictions though. The biggest restriction though is that a mastermind can play a card on an NPC, and then a hero can also play a card on that NPC, but no other heroes can ever play another card on that single NPC. So the most amount of cards that ever be played on an NPC or played on a location is 2. 1 from the mastermind and 1 from one of the heroes. There's also one more additional requirement beyond that. Certain amount of cards, if they're played too many of them, they can actually cancel each other out. The challenge here is that the protagonists are never allowed to discuss during the loops exactly which cards they're playing. Now, between loops, when they're regrouping and everything is resetting, they're free to discuss and decide exactly which tactics they want to take during the loop, which the mastermind is free to abuse and free to listen and free to eavesdrop on and try to figure out exactly what their plans are. But once the loop is started, players are never allowed to discuss exactly which cards they're playing. Other players can see where they're playing their cards, but they're never exactly allowed to say, hey, I'm playing a forbid intrigue card here. And that's very, very important here, because if 2 protagonists ever play forbid intrigue cards at the same time during the same day, both of these cards actually cancel each other out, and then the intrigue still happens. That's very, very important. So our heroes need to make sure they're making their plans properly and in advance, otherwise they may end up just canceling their plans out completely 100%. Like I said earlier, every one of our protagonists gets a deck of cards, and these deck of cards are exactly the same. They have the exact same cards inside them, and they all do the exact same thing for all our heroes. For example, there's the +2 Goodwill card, which if this is played on an NPC, it's going to allow the heroes to add Goodwill to that NPC. Now remember, adding Goodwill allows them to start triggering the special abilities of these NPCs. Heroes have movement cards, which allow them to move the NPCs left and right, or up and down, or they can just go ahead and forbid moving completely, which is very, very important, especially if they happen to know that, for example, they know that the class rep happens to be a killer, and they know that the alien happens to be a key person, so they want to prevent this class rep from ever moving into this section. So what they may want to do at some point is play the forbid movement card on this alien, on the class rep, preventing the class rep from moving up into the shrine and killing the alien. Now the important thing to understand here is that all these cards are going to be played face down, and they're all going to be revealed at the exact same time. So the mastermind never knows exactly which cards the protagonist is playing, and the protagonist never know exactly which cards the mastermind is playing until they've all been revealed. The heroes also get cards that allow them to add paranoias onto the NPCs, which could be important, especially if they want to trigger certain things like maybe cause somebody to kill somebody who's been a thorn in their side. They can also gain 1 goodwill instead of 2. They can forbid intrigue, which is the intrigue can help the mastermind cause disasters to start occurring, or they can start lowering the paranoia that is on these NPCs. Now the important thing to understand about all these cards that our heroes get is that some cards can only be played once per loop, and you can recognize these cards because they all have the 1 per loop symbol on them only. So for example, Paranoia -1 can only be played 1 time per loop by this specific hero. Remember, every single hero gets their own deck of cards, while Forbidden Intrigue can be played every single day if they want to. But the trick is you need to make sure you're not playing Forbidden Intrigue when another hero is, because remember, 2 or more forbidden intrigues at the same time on the same day cancel each other out. Now the mastermind gets pretty much the same cards as the protagonist, except they get a couple extra cards. For example, they get additional movement cards that allow them to move the NPCs instead of left and right and up and down. They can also move NPCs diagonally, although like this cards with this symbol, they can only use that card 1 time per loop. Additionally, the mastermind also gets the ability to forbid cards played by the other players, but again, the mastermind has mostly the same abilities as our heroes, just more geared towards helping them win the scenario. Now the interesting thing here is that cards can always be played on NPCs, but cards can also be played at locations. Now generally the only card that will ever matter at a location, when it's played at a location specifically by the mastermind, will be intrigue cards, whether it's the +2 intrigue card or the +1 intrigue card. Those are the only cards that will ever have an effect at a location. But the mastermind is free to bluff if they like and play a non-intrigue card at a location. Now why would they do that? Well, they want to do that to force the players to start wasting moves and wasting cards and wasting their actions. Let's say, for example, I as a mastermind play a card face down at this location, and then I play another card face down at this location, knowing full well as a mastermind that if I get enough intrigue on the hospital, I can cause a tragedy to occur. So the players, knowing this, they want to try to stop me from doing this. So this player plays that card right here, and then this player places this card right here in the hopes of stopping my bad thing from happening. Well, what would happen is we would reveal this card and see that's a Paranoia +1. And remember, the only thing that can go on a location is intrigue. So I, as the mastermind, have managed to bluff and fool the heroes and force them to waste one of the forbidden intrigue cards. And not only that, this intrigue will go off, and this forbidden intrigue card won't happen, because remember the basic rule that if 2 forbidden intrigue cards are ever played during the same day, they cancel each other out. It doesn't happen. The intrigue still goes off. And if it happens to be a scenario which requires me to get 2 intrigue on the school and some kind of disaster happens, I, as the mastermind, have managed to make my plot happen. There's only 2 kind of conflicts that can ever occur, basically, when cards are played by the mastermind and the heroes. The first one is forbidden intrigue and intrigue cards. The way it works is forbidden always happens before what could occur unless multiple forbidden intrigue occurs. So for example, if the players were actually smart and only played 1 forbidden intrigue card on me to stop me from getting this intrigue, that card played by the heroes would actually go off and my intrigue card would actually be wasted. And again, since that's a 1 per loop, I'd actually lose access to that card for that entire loop. So that's the one time a forbiddance card will work. The other conflict that may occur is when it comes to movement cards. If the mastermind plays a movement card and our heroes also play a movement card, you're going to see a little chart that's going to be listed right down below that will list what the actual movement would occur. So if an up-down played by the mastermind and a left-right played by the heroes would go off, it would actually cause this movement to occur. So on left-right and an up-down would cause, if both these cards were played on the same NPC, would actually force this NPC to move diagonally. Now the only trick you need to pay attention to is some NPCs are not allowed to enter certain locations. So if the movement cards would force an invalid movement, that movement card is actually canceled. So just a quick overview and just a reminder, only one card can be played per team at a location or by an NPC. So that means that only one Mastermind card can be played on the Doctor, and only one Protagonist card can be played on the Doctor. Only one Mastermind card can be played at a location, and only one Protagonist card can be played at that location. And finally, each one of the script sheets are going to be used by our heroes to try to put all these pieces of the puzzle together and try to deduce exactly what is going on by watching what the Mastermind is doing and try to counteract and stopping those actions from happening and stopping the Masterminder's dastardly plans. Basically, it's up to our heroes to try to figure out which plots are going on, which subplots are going on, which roles are going on, which incidents are occurring, use all the goodwill from the NPCs involved in this scenario, and try to stop the bad thing from happening. One important reminder though is in any first step scenario, there's only going to be one main plot and one subplot. In every basic tragedy, there's going to be one main plot and two subplots, and we need to use that information as the heroes are trying to deduce exactly what's going on. For example, if we find out by deducing what's going on that there's a murder plan, we know that there has to be a key person involved, there has to be a killer, and there has to be a brain involved in that. So we just need to figure out exactly which NPCs happen to be fulfilling those roles. If we happen to know that there happens to be an unknown factor X subplot going on, we know that there happens to be one NPC fulfilling the role of the factor. Now remember, if we can deduce all the roles at the end of the scenario, even if we failed every one of the loops, we as a protagonist still win, and the Mastermind still loses the scenario. Now that you have a rough overview of the game, I'm going to go ahead and show you exactly how to play the game of Tragedy Looper and give you specifics on exactly how the turn flow actually goes. So in the very first thing we need to do as a Mastermind, we need to pick a scenario for the players to play through, and every single person again is going to get their scenario card. You have the card for the protagonist, which gives them a rough idea of exactly which day there's going to be some incidents and how many days they get and how many loops and how many, which is basically how many chances they get to try to complete and win the scenario. While the Mastermind gets basically the complete scenario, knows everything that's involved. They know every single NPC, they know what roles those NPCs are going to be, whether the alien happens to be some subhuman creature whose eventual goal is to try to kill the girl student, and the mystery boy who happened to be going to the same school, and the girl student's father happens to be the police officer, and the mystery boy's father happens to be the doctor. But this is all information that the Mastermind knows and the players don't. They need to deduce and try to figure out and stop the tragedies from happening. Once the scripts have been chosen, the data board needs to be set up with exactly which day we're on, which days are going to happen to have an incident occur if the requirements are met for that incident, and also how many loops they get to try to figure things out. The next thing we need to do is, as a group, the players need to figure out how much table talk they are going to actually allow. Now, it's suggested that once everybody knows how to play the game, you do not allow any table talk at all while the scenario is going on. But basically what table talk means is that while the scenario is going on, players are allowed to discuss and decide exactly what they're doing and what cards they're playing. Now, the trick is the more table talk you allow, the easier it is for the protagonist and the more difficult it is for the Mastermind. And it's kind of against the spirit of the game, so that's why they use that as kind of a crutch when you're learning how to play the game. They say you can allow the table talk, which basically means that players can say, look, I'm going to play this card on this NPC right here. Maybe somebody should play this card and we need to figure out what's going on. But once the table talk has been turned off, the only time players can discuss exactly what their plans are is in between each loop when everything is resetting, and the players may plan what they're doing and the Mastermind may eavesdrop on those plans. But once the loop is started, players are never allowed to discuss exactly what cards they're playing at which location. Basically what's going to happen is the leader is going to play their card after the Mastermind has played all three of their cards. Then the next player is going to play their one card, and finally the last player is going to play their card. Again, they are not allowed to discuss what cards they're playing or which NPCs are going to be visiting. That was all discussed between the loop, and now they must carry out their plans, knowing full well that the Mastermind was eavesdropping on their plans. While the amount of information our heroes happen to have is always going to be limited, there are some rules that every single scenario needs to abide by. Now, when we're playing a basic tragedy, you already know this, I've already said this a few times, but there's going to be one main plot and two subplots, but there's also going to be some roles. Now, not every role is going to be involved in every single scenario, but each one of these NPCs can potentially be one of these roles. The trick here is no NPC can have more than one single role. So if we find out that the girl student is the key person, that's the only role she can ever have. She can't be the key person and the killer. She can't be the key person and the time traveler. She can only be the key person. And the alien, or the not quite human person, can only be the killer. She can never have another role. And the mystery boy, for example, in this made-up scenario, happens to be the factor. That's the only role he can ever have. He can only be the factor for this scenario. Additionally, every single NPC is only allowed to be the cause of one single incident. So one NPC cannot be the cause of more than one incident. So for example, if there happens to be a murder on the second day, we know that only one person can cause that murder, and that person can only be involved in that incident. So for example, if the alien happens to be the murderer, they can't also be the butterfly effect of cause. They can only cause the one single incident. So in this made-up scenario, we as a mastermind know that the alien is the killer, and we also know that they're going to cause the murder incident on the second day. And once the players figure that out, that's a bit of knowledge they can have to start abusing and using to try to figure out and get to the bottom of this specific scenario. So the players are going to try to use this knowledge to, again, try to figure out which plots are going on by figuring out which roles happen to be going on. So for example, if our heroes figure out that the alien happens to be a killer, by figuring out what is being done and what's occurring, we can use that information as the heroes and know that if there's a killer involved, we know that the only possible main plots that be going on is a murder plan, because murder plan has a killer involved with it. So we've already figured out the main plot as the heroes. So now we know that since there is a killer and we know that the main plot is a murder plan, we know that there happens to also be a key person. So we'll need to figure that out, who the key person is. And we know that there's also going to be a brain, so we need to figure out which one of these NPCs happens to be the brain. Remember, if we reduce as the heroes all the roles, even if we fail all the loops, we still win the game. So things happen to go on, and we also happen to find out there is a mystery boy who happens to be the factor. That is his role. We can look at this list and see which kind of subplots involve the factor. Well, only one of these subplots involve the factor, and that's the unknown factor X subplot. So now, as the heroes, we figured out that there's going to be a murder plan, and we know that there's going to be an unknown factor X, so we just need to figure out which last subplot is involved, and that can also help us figure out which roles are involved, again, so we win the scenario. Every single loop is going to play out the same, going across every single day, and every single day is basically a turn in the game. So every single day, we're going to have a morning phase, then we're going to get a chance for everybody to play their cards. Then we're going to get a chance for abilities to go off. Then we're going to check for incidences. And then the night phase is going to occur. And if nothing bad, no tragedy happens during this entire turn, the day cycle is going to advance. And then we're going to do that entire cycle again. And we're going to keep doing that until our heroes make it through the final day without the tragedy happening. Or one of these tragedies is going to happen and the day cycle is going to reset and the loop counter is going to go down. And our heroes are one round closer to losing the game. The very first phase of every single day is going to start with the morning phase. Now, generally, not too much is going to happen during the morning phase unless there happens to be a specific NPC involved in the scenario who may trigger something to happen. For example, new NPCs may actually enter the scenario during later loops, such as the godly being who has the ability to enter the scenario during later loops, or the friend, if they happen to be involved in the scenario, will gain some goodwill as long as they've been revealed to our heroes and they know who their friend happens to be. After the day phase, or the morning phase, it's now time for our players to start playing cards, and this is going to actually start with the Mastermind. The Mastermind, first, before the Protagonist gets to play 3 cards down, and remember, we can play these cards either on a location or directly on an NPC. It's up to us depending on exactly what we want to do. But we get to play up to 3 cards any way we want, and then these cards are going to resolve after we play all these cards at their locations. After the Mastermind has played their 3 cards, starting with the leader, every single one of our protagonists gets to play 1 single card. This does mean that each team gets to play a total of 3 cards, but the Mastermind plays 3 alone, and each protagonist gets to play 1 single card. And basically, our players, again, just like the Mastermind, can play 1 card on an NPC, or they're free to play a card on a single location. But the rule states in the game that no NPC or no location can never have more than 2 cards placed on it. 1 from a Mastermind and then 1 from the protagonist. And then after all the players get a chance to play all their cards, all these cards are going to resolve. And here's the trick. The mastermind resolves all the cards, not the players. Now, the important thing to understand here is all the cards are basically resolved at the same time, but we can't resolve them all at the same time. So we're basically going to pick a location and start resolving cards. The important thing to understand here is that mandatory actions always occur before optional actions. That will be a very important thing to understand when it comes down to timing issues. But basically, I, as the mastermind, again, the mastermind resolves all the cards. We'll flip over all the cards and we'll go ahead and resolve all the interactions of all these cards. So in this example, the mastermind played an intrigue card and this player played a forbidden intrigue card. So these 2 cards cancel each other out and nothing's going to happen. And since neither one of these cards have the once per loop icon on them, these cards are going to be returned to the card's owners. So the mastermind gets that card back and this player gets their card back. Then we get to come over here and resolve this card. We're going to resolve this card as the mastermind, which will be a movement card, which allows us to move the not quite human person into the school. This card doesn't have the once per loop, so this goes back to the mastermind. And then we get to pick any one of the cards left to resolve next. We'll resolve this card right here, which is going to allow us to give 2 Goodwill to the journalist. So we, as a mastermind, will put 2 Goodwill down on the journalist. And this does mean that the journalist can now start activating their Goodwill abilities for our heroes. Now this card has the once per loop icon on it, so that means that this card is going to be returned to this player, but it's going to be left face up to let them know they don't have access to that card anymore for the rest of the loop. Then we simply just continue to resolve all the cards as the mastermind. If they're once per loop, we give them back to the player face up. Otherwise, they simply go back to that player's hand. And then once we've resolved all the cards, we're pretty much done with the card resolution. We're done with the playing cards phase. We now get to move on to the ability phase of the round. For the resolve abilities phase of the turn, first we're going to start with the mastermind. Just like the card playing phase, the mastermind gets to go first, and the mastermind gets to look at all the NPCs currently involved in the scenario, and if any of those NPCs have an ability that can be triggered at this point, and if those abilities are optional, the mastermind is free to go ahead and select those options without telling the players exactly what is going on. So for example, in this made-up scenario, this is only information the mastermind would have. The police officer happens to be the brain. Well, if we happen to look at the brain, we see that he has a special ability that he can add 1 intrigue counter to another NPC in the same location, or actually to the location itself. So me as the mastermind, I have the option. Again, I may not want to do this if I think it's going to give too much information to the protagonist, but I'm free to take 1 intrigue counter and I would place it on one of the other NPCs or exactly on the location. And now that I've done that action, I've given the protagonist a little bit of a hint of what's going on. They're immediately going to start looking at the rolls and start figuring out that's going to give them another clue of exactly what is going on during this scenario. The trick here, and this is very, very important, this is the hardest thing to understand, to learn about the game when you're learning how to be a good mastermind in this game, is when you're using abilities, you always want to be extremely vague so you're not saying exactly what's going on. You're never going to say something like, okay, on my turn, the police officer who's the brain uses his intrigue ability to put intrigue on the journalist. That's not what you're going to do. It's about being vague. It's about being deceitful and not saying exactly why things are happening. So it would be much better as the mastermind to say, something odd happens and the journalist gains intrigue. And of course, you as a mastermind, you're free to hand this up as much as you want to add a lot more theme and enjoyment to the game. Just remember, as a mastermind, use very vague comments such as, the boy student seems very, very scared. Or even saying something along the lines of, tragically, all of our heroes have died. After our mastermind has used any abilities that they want to use, it's now up to our heroes to use any Goodwill abilities that they have access to. Now remember, the requirement for a Goodwill ability is that the NPC that you want to use the Goodwill ability of has to have that minimum amount of Goodwill on them, otherwise you can't use a Goodwill ability. So for example, the police officer only has 2 Goodwill on him, so we cannot use either of his abilities as the protagonist. But the journalist happens to have 2 Goodwill on him, so we actually have access to both of the journalist's Goodwill abilities as the protagonist. Now the important thing here is the protagonist, the leader, decides which one of the Goodwill abilities they want to use that they have access to. But all they simply do is they point at one of the NPCs and they say, I want to use this Goodwill ability. They don't actually resolve it, and this is very important. It's up for the mastermind to resolve it. because some of the NPCs have something called Goodwill refusal. And this is a very, very important concept that some people get wrong when they're playing Tragedy Looper. Some NPCs and some of these roles have what's called optional goodwill refusal, and some of them have what's called mandatory goodwill refusal. This doesn't mean that these NPCs can never gain goodwill. It just means that when they use their goodwill abilities, there's a chance that they may never go off. For example, if the key person, and let's say the key person in this scenario happens to be the girl student, and her requirement happens to be 2 goodwill to use her special ability, if she's the key person and she has 2 goodwill on her, and the leader says, I choose to use the girl student's goodwill ability, the mastermind has the option of saying, you try to incur and use her goodwill, but for some reason she's not willing to assist you. And then the goodwill is not removed, the goodwill stays there, and now the players, the protagonists, need to figure out, did she refuse to use her goodwill ability because it's an optional goodwill refusal, or it's a mandatory goodwill refusal? Optional means me as the mastermind, I can say, you know what, the goodwill happens. Of course, I'm not going to say that again because it's about being vague and not being specific. So it's optional, and the leader decides to point at this character, this NPC, and say, I'm using their goodwill ability. The mastermind can just simply resolve the effect, or if it's optional, they can say, for some reason they don't want to assist you right now. Whereas opposed to it says goodwill refusal is mandatory, if this person's in the scenario and you use their goodwill ability, you simply as mastermind say they refuse to assist you. So now it's another clue for our protagonists for them to try to figure out exactly which roles are going on and possibly figure out what plots and subplots are occurring. I just want to emphasize the point though, goodwill refusal doesn't mean they can never gain goodwill. It just controls whether they can use their goodwill abilities or not. And of course, our heroes are free to use as many goodwill abilities as they have access to. And a matter of fact, if an NPC has more than one goodwill ability and they have enough goodwill on them, they're free to use both of the goodwill abilities. But remember, each goodwill ability can only be used once per day. So for example, the journalist could use both of their abilities this day, unless it happens to be a special ability like this one that says it's only usable once per loop. Then it's not usable every single day. It's usable once per loop. And then you have to remember as a player that that ability is no longer accessible. And of course, I said this earlier, and I just want to say it again, just in case you forget, just because an NPC dies, don't ever remove the goodwill from them, because goodwill stays on them when they come back to life. For some scenarios that can happen, that goodwill still happens to be on that NPC. Very important point that some people miss when they're playing Tragedy Looper. After we resolve abilities, it's time to resolve incidents if the requirements for that incident have occurred or have been met. For example, if this happened to be a scenario and it happens to be the second day and our heroes know that there's going to be a murder on the second day, and for example, let's just say the doctor happens to be in the shrine with a not quite human sparkly person here, and let's say Miss Sparkly here happens to have 2 paranoia counters on her, and we're now at the incident phase, and I announce as the mastermind, a tragedy has occurred and the doctor has died. That means an incident has occurred, and this is another clue for our heroes, our protagonists, to try to deduce exactly what's going on. So they know that there was a murder. They know that the murder occurred. Well, it takes paranoia to cause an incident to occur, so we now have a clue that the alien is involved in a murder, and that murder has caused the doctor to die. But if I, as a mastermind, don't announce the end of the loop, then that's a good clue that the doctor is not the key person, because it says that the key person is ever dead, the loop ends immediately. So again, this is another clue for our protagonists to help them try to figure out exactly what the scenario is. And again, just to overemphasize the point, remember, us as the mastermind resolving all these incidents must be very vague and say simply to the effect of, a tragedy has occurred and the doctor has died. Never ever saying exactly why that occurred. That's up for the players to deduce. After the mastermind has checked for any and all incidents that may occur, it's now time for the leader role to switch to the next player, and this player is going to be the leader in the next day, just as long as the loop didn't end. And even if the loop ends, the leader is still going to switch, but if the loop ends, of course, we're going to reset everything, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Just remember, after we check for the incident, the leader role is going to switch to the next player in line, and then we're going to move on to the night phase. Now, the night phase is when various things can occur, various roles can occur, various different incidents can occur. but this is going to be when certain things can happen. For example, there is some kind of occurrence that can occur during the night phase. If we look down here for the killer, it says that if the killer ever has 4 intrigue on them, when it gets to the night phase, all the protagonists die. So in this scenario, if this happened to happen right here, and the alien happened to be the killer, and they happen to have 4 intrigue on them, the mastermind would simply look at our heroes and inform them that they all have died. Again, not telling them how they died, not telling them the cause. It's up for them to deduce and try to figure out which caused that to happen. So when the loop resets, they need to stop that tragedy from occurring. If our players have managed to play smart and they manage to deduce what's going on, they may survive through that day. We're going to move on to the next day, and we're going to play the exact same round, the exact same way, starting with the morning phase, the playing cards, the abilities, the instant, and the night phase. And we're going to keep doing that until we make it through all the days as the heroes, or the mastermind manages to cause a tragedy to occur, which is going to cause a tragedy counter to keep counting down. If the tragedy counter ever gets down all the way to the bottom, the players have lost unless they can deduce all the roles of the NPCs. If our heroes ever make it through one complete loop without a tragedy occurring, our heroes have won the game. Additionally, if at any time all of our protagonists die, such as the killer getting 4 intrigue on them, that will also end a loop and end the day cycle, forcing a reset. If our protagonists get to the end of the loop and they can't figure out what's going on and the final loop does happen, and they get to the point where they get to make the guesses, before they're allowed to make their guesses, you need to make sure that you reset the board completely, returning all the NPCs to their location. All counters need to be returned to whatever pile you have them for, and everything gets fully reset, and it's now up to our heroes to figure out if they can deduce exactly which role every single NPC was involved in for that scenario. Now it's required that they figure out every single role, whether that NPC had a specific role or they didn't have a role at all. If they successfully deduce every single NPC and their exact role they played, they still manage to win. But if they get even one single role wrong, they have lost, the mastermind has won, and the tragedy of the history of the time flow has been permanently changed for the mastermind to create havoc throughout history. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video for Tragedy Looper. I know this was a little bit long and a little bit wordy, but I wanted to make sure I got all the points across because there's a little bit of fiddliness to this game. And it's very, very important for the mastermind to understand exactly all the mechanics for this game. And I'll get into this when I get into my review, but this is one of those games where if you get even one minor thing wrong as a mastermind, you might as well just reset everything and start all the way from square one. So yes, I admit this was a more wordier tutorial, but I want to make sure I got all the minor points of the game to make sure you as a mastermind and also you as the players, the protagonists, can understand exactly how to play Tragedy Looper. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial video for Tragedy Looper. Stick around and check out my sample gameplay video if you want, but again, big warning, it's full of spoilers. I basically ruined the first scenario for the game. So if you don't want that ruined for you, you want to have that enjoyment, make sure you skip that and go ahead and check out my full video review for Tragedy Looper. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the YouTube comments down below. You all can also feel free to email me at offtheshelfboardgamereviews, that's OSTBGR @gmail.com. And as always, thanks for watching.